Welcome to the explainer that is absolutely going to shatter everything you thought you knew about primitive survival. Honestly, I couldn't believe this when I first read it. We always focus on the dramatic stuff from early human history, right? The saber-toothed cats, the epic migrations, those intense intra-tribal battles, but we completely ignore the most unglamorous, relentless, and arguably most consistent killer our ancestors ever faced.
Picture this. Imagine trading your cozy, climate-controlled apartment for prehistoric Europe. For us, a rainy day is what? A minor inconvenience? We've got roofs, central heating, a full fridge, and endless phone distractions to wait it out. But take all of that away. Literally all of it. No walls, no dry clothes, absolutely no waterproof jackets. Imagine being stuck in a rainy season that does not end for weeks, with the temperature hovering right around a damp, miserable 10 degrees Celsius.
So it begs the question, how do you actually survive endless rain? This isn't just some fun thought experiment. It was a terrifying baseline reality for the vast majority of human history. When everything you need to survive, like fire, food, and warmth, becomes exponentially harder to get the wetter it gets, what do you do?
Well, today we're unpacking the layered defense system ancient humans used to completely master these wet, freezing environments. We'll be looking at the real threat of heat loss, fire as living infrastructure, engineering shelters and waterproofing, reading landscapes and weather, and finally biological and social survival.
Let's jump right into part 1, the real threat, heat loss. We really have to understand that the immediate danger of endless rain wasn't drowning. It was the rapid, silent draining of your core body temperature. To put that into perspective, water conducts heat away from the human body 25 times faster than air. 25 times! So the true killer was heat loss. We're not talking about just feeling a bit chilly here. It's the difference between sitting in a cool room and dying in a cold lake. When you're soaked to the bone, your metabolism simply cannot keep up. It makes a mild, damp, windy day absolutely lethal. You see, hypothermia doesn't actually need freezing temperatures. It literally just needs wet clothes and a stiff breeze. Which brings us to our second point, fire as living infrastructure. To combat this terrifying reality of heat loss, ancient humans fundamentally redefined their relationship with fire. There is this chillingly accurate saying, "A dead fire in a hypothermic situation is not an inconvenience. It is a death sentence written in wet ash." In a relentless downpour, fire and water are mortal enemies, and wet wood just won't ignite. Ancient humans weren't out there trying to spark fires from scratch in the pouring rain. I mean, that is nearly impossible with bare hands. Instead, they treated fire exactly like we treat our modern electrical grid. It was a continuous, living utility. It was never, ever allowed to die. Because of this, we see the birth of one of the first distinct human jobs, the designated firekeeper. These people developed absolute master techniques to shield and transport living embers across the landscape. They'd wrap coals in slow-burning organic material, things like damp moss or specific types of tree bark. The Inuit used enclosed smoldering containers to keep things going. We even have archaeological evidence of European hearths that burned continuously for literally years. Someone's specific, critical job during a massive storm was to just sit with that fire, shield it, and feed it so the rest of the group didn't wake up cold, dark, and dying.
But, of course, a fire needs a roof to survive a downpour, right? So let's look at part 3, engineering shelters and waterproofing.
Okay, first things first, we have to completely shatter a massive misconception. Forget the myth of the primitive caveman. It's mostly just an artifact of preservation bias, meaning caves are simply where archaeological evidence survives the best. In reality, caves were damp, they were incredibly rare, and honestly, they were often already full of dangerous predators. So instead of relying on caves, ancient humans engineered their own complex environments.
And this architectural engineering evolved over mind-bogglingly long periods. I'm talking 400,000 years ago, hominins, who actually had smaller brains than us, were already building angled branch shelters. They used overlapping leaf shingles just to shed the rain. Jump forward to 15,000 years ago in Eastern Europe, and modern humans are engineering these elaborate mammoth bone structures. They were heavily anchored into the ground to resist the wind, and they even had internal insulation. These were absolutely not just holes to hide in, they were deliberately engineered microclimates.
And the materials they used? Revolutionary. Transforming a raw animal hide into waterproof leather by scraping it down and treating it with animal fats wasn't just some basic craft, it was a massive cognitive leap. Think about it. It required deep abstract planning. You're hunting and processing an animal today, spending days treating its hide, all to solve a future problem of heavy weather that might not happen for weeks. It strongly suggests that the drive to stay dry literally pushed human cognitive evolution forward over 120,000 years ago. Now, beyond their physical tools, their survival relied on something we have almost entirely lost today. Let's move to part 4, reading landscapes and weather.
Today, we kind of just experience weather as something that happens to us, right? We just check a weather app. We've totally outsourced our environmental awareness to technology. But ancient humans? They fluently read the sky and animal behavior. They smelled petrichor, that distinct scent of approaching rain. They noticed when birds started flying lower, when insects suddenly swarmed, or when clouds changed texture and the wind shifted. By continuously reading these signals like giant road signs, groups made collaborative decisions to seek shelter hours before a single drop of rain ever fell.
And where they chose to take that shelter was a literal life or death decision. Terrain selection was everything. Bad terrain meant setting up in hollows and valleys where cold, wet air sinks and pools. If you camped there, you'd wake up sitting in inches of freezing water. Good terrain, on the other hand, meant finding south-facing slopes that catch the sunlight and dry out way faster. Or camping under dense broadleaf canopies that naturally intercept the rain. They basically used the landscape itself as a massive head start on waterproofing.
But you know what? Perhaps their greatest tools weren't external at all. This brings us to our final core section, biological and social survival.
A really crucial point here is that their bodies were literally trained by the environment. Take the cold shock response, for example. That's that deadly autonomic reaction, the hyperventilation and cardiovascular stress you get when you suddenly fall into freezing water. Ancient humans actively dulled this response through continuous, lifelong exposure. Plus, they burned brown adipose tissue, which is a specific type of fat that directly generates heat from within. So they weren't just biologically different. They were incredibly well-conditioned humans who couldn't exactly just walk over and turn up a thermostat.
Then here's another thing. They never, ever fought the weather alone. The whole lone survivor trope, braving a prehistoric rainy season completely solo, that is pure modern Hollywood fiction. Social bonds were literal survival infrastructure. They relied heavily on shared body heat, sleeping in these dense, communal, incredibly pragmatic arrangements where children were safely kept in the warm center. They delegated all the hard weather labor based on physical ability.
And this is fascinating. Caring for elderly members of the group wasn't just some abstract act of kindness. Elders were walking, living encyclopedias. They held the institutional, generational knowledge of, say, which tree bark burns best when it's damp, how to read a very specific animal's pre-storm behavior, or exactly where the best natural rock overhangs were located in a 50-mile radius. Keeping them alive was the highly rational preservation of the group's absolute best, unwritten survival guide.
We also have to talk about how they ate during these endless storms. Heavy rain completely hides regular food. Game animals take cover, roots get heavily waterlogged, and maintaining fires for cooking is a nightmare. So, they adapted with incredible foresight, relying on strategic underground caches of dried meat and nuts they had buried weeks prior. But they also ate opportunistically based on exactly what the rain brought out. I'm talking massive numbers of surfacing earthworms, freshwater fish moving in new flood patterns, prolific fungi, snails, and frogs. Total flexibility was a pure survival trait, and sharing that food equitably was what kept the entire group breathing. All of this brings us to a shocking realization that completely flips our understanding of human migration. Ancient humans didn't just endure these brutal climates because they got stuck there. Actually, scratch that. They actively migrated into them. They willingly moved into monsoon-soaked Asia, the perpetually wet coastal temperate rainforests of Europe, and wildly flooding river deltas. So why do that? Because of the sheer abundance of rain. The very same rains that made survival incredibly difficult also powered highly productive ecosystems. These wet environments were absolutely packed with fish, game, and edible plants. They made a deeply calculated choice that the brutal difficulty of managing the wetness was a fair trade-off for the massive abundance those conditions produced. They saw rain as a condition to be managed, not some alien threat they needed to hide from.
Which leaves us with this final thought to chew on. Today, you and I have Gore-Tex, we've got insulated walls, Doppler weather radar, and central heating. But every single technology we use to manage the weather today is entirely downstream of their stubborn, incredible refusal to simply give up and get rained on. Knowing what it actually took, the continuous fires, the scraped hides, those deep communal bonds, could you survive the long wet night that built the very foundation of human civilization? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Until next time, stay curious, and hey, maybe appreciate that roof over your head just a little bit more today.